What in the world makes us so embarrassed about the gospel? For I determined to know nothing among you except Jesus Christ and Him crucified. There have always been critics who said that Jesus was a noble teacher. He was a religious leader. He was a spiritual man. He had grandiose ideas of what he wanted to accomplish. He wanted to teach people true religion. He wanted to teach people morality and virtue. He made a noble effort at it, but it all kind of went bad. It all ended up in a terrible tragedy. He got caught in the gears of his own ambition, and he ended up dead. And the critics have often said this was not the plan. It was a tragic ending to a noble effort. Well, of course, nothing could be further from the truth than that Jesus was surprised by his death. Jesus was not surprised by his death. He came for that purpose. The murder of Jesus came as no surprise to him. The cross was the very reason for which he came. Scripture says he was the Lamb slain from before the foundation of the world. And believe me, from before the foundation of the world, the eternal Son knew exactly why he was coming into the world. And even Jesus, the man in the world, understood that the purpose of his incarnation was his death and resurrection. So he lived in the perfect understanding of the inevitability of the cross. And in the days prior to his death, the weeks and months prior to his death, he spoke often about what was coming. Contrary to being a surprise, he knew the details before the people who carried them out even knew the details. For example, in Mark 8:31, he began to teach his followers that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders and the chief priests and the scribes, that would compose the Sanhedrin, the ruling body of Israel, and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. And he was stating the matter plainly. There was absolutely no mistaking the fact that he knew about his coming death and he knew about its details. Verse 9, as they were coming down the mountain, gave them orders not to relate to anyone what they had seen until the Son of Man rose from the dead. So he knows he's going to die. He knows he is going to rise. Verse 31 of that same chapter again. This time he's in Galilee and he's teaching his disciples. He says the Son of Man is to be delivered into the hands of men. They will kill him, and when he has been killed, he will rise 3 days later. Again in chapter 10, verse 32, they were on the road now going to Jerusalem. Jesus walking ahead of them. He took the 12 aside at the end of the verse there, and then verse 33, he said to them, "Behold, we're going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be delivered to the chief priests and the scribes. They will condemn him to death, hand him over to the Gentiles. They will mock him and spit on him and scourge him and kill him, and 3 days later he will rise again." Neither the Jewish leaders nor the Roman executioners knew that any of this was going to happen the way he said it was going to happen, but it was all pre-written history. He knew what was going to happen, how it was going to happen. He knew when it was going to happen. We have to go to Jerusalem for the Passover. That's when it's going to happen. And he knew the purpose of it. In the 45th verse of that 10th chapter, he said, "The Son of Man didn't come to be served, but to serve and give his life a ransom for many." He would die not a solo death of a disappointed man, but he would die a death that was a ransom to God for many. He understood the substitutionary reality of his death. He knew he would die. He knew the circumstances around that death engaged the Jews and the Jewish leadership. It also engaged the Roman executioners, and the purpose of God was ransom for those whom God had chosen. So as we approach the text in chapter 12, Jesus tells a parable. He fabricates it. He makes stories up. That's what the parables are. He invents these stories, stories that would be easily understood by everybody listening to them, to explain spiritual realities and divine purposes. It is Wednesday of Passion Week. It is Wednesday. He has entered into the city on Monday and is very popular, very, very popular. Masses of humanity, numbering in the hundreds of thousands, have come out on that Monday and hailed him as their Messiah. We remember that. His popularity is huge. On Tuesday, there is a display not so much of his popularity, although that continued into Tuesday, but his power. He has amazing presence and power because he goes into the temple, you remember, and he just wipes out the criminal businesses that were conducted there by the priests. He has great power. That power has been on display. He has great popularity. That popularity has been on display. Maybe at this point, if he were just a normal man, he would be saying, this thing couldn't be going any better than it's going right now. They run from me when I threaten them, and they run to me when I welcome them. I have control over people. I can draw them to me. I can chase them away. This is immense power that he exhibits. And yet, in the face of such popularity and such power, he knows that in 2 days he will be on a cross. He knows that. Here we find him, as we come to chapter 12, in the temple area. For at least a day or so, it is vacated by the corrupt businesses. For at least a little while, it is a God-honoring place, as long as it is filled with his presence and his preaching. The leaders of Israel hate him. They hate him for his popularity because they see his ascendancy as diminishing their popularity and consequently their influence and power and prestige. But they hate him doubly because of what he's done to their businesses. The indirect attack by a greater competing popularity, and the direct attack by coming into the temple and wreaking havoc on their operation, has caused them to want him dead more than ever. They've been wanting him dead for a long time, throughout the duration of his ministry, basically since he did this before at the beginning of his ministry when he came into the temple and made a whip and threw them out. They've wanted him dead for 3 years, but now more than ever. At this particular point, their desire for his death and his understanding of his coming death come together in a story. This is a dramatic story. It is a story that will suck them in. It'll pull them in until they indict themselves, and they'll actually realize they've done that. It's an unforgettable story. It's an unmistakable story that points to the evil, murderous intent of the leaders of Israel, and it also points to the death of Christ. He knows that both are a reality. Let me read the story to you. Verse 1, he began to speak to them in parables. A man planted a vineyard and put a wall around it and dug a vat under the winepress and built a tower and rented it out to vine growers and went on a journey. At the harvest time, he sent a slave to the vine growers in order to receive some of the produce of the vineyard from the vine growers. They took him and beat him and sent him away empty-handed. Again, he sent them another slave, and they wounded him in the head and treated him shamefully. He sent another one, and that one they killed. And so with many others, beating some and killing others. He had one more to send, a beloved son. He sent him last of all to them, saying, "They will respect my son." But those vine growers said to one another, "This is the heir. Come, let us kill him, and the inheritance will be ours." They took him and killed him and threw him out of the vineyard. What will the owner of the vineyard do? He will come and destroy the vine growers and will give the vineyard to others. This story is also recorded in Matthew chapter 21, verses 33 and following, and in Luke chapter 20, verses 9 and following. You notice that it begins by saying he began to speak to them in parables. That is true. Matthew gives us 3 parables that he used. Mark only records the main one, and that's this one. The story is designed to escalate their hostility toward the tenant farmers. The story is designed to escalate the hearing audience anger at the tenant farmers for what they have done. It's a horrific kind of behavior. Certainly the religious leaders in Israel couldn't tolerate something like this. They were legalists to the bone. You know, they would want to rise up and say, I've kept the law perfectly or as perfectly as possible. They wanted to keep the law on the outside, even if they couldn't keep it on the inside, as the Sermon on the Mount indicates. They were religious legalists. The rest of the crowd, after all, were in the temple area. They were there for Passover. They were worshiping. They would have been, to one degree or another, good people on the level of human goodness, nothing more than that. So they would have been outraged at this kind of murderous behavior. And that's the whole point. Jesus wants to incite outrage at the behavior of these tenant farmers. The drama unfolds in such a way that you can't escape getting drawn into the horror of this behavior. They prided themselves on their devotion to the temple, the people and the leaders. They prided themselves on their devotion to the law. They prided themselves on their kindness and their goodness. And of course, in order to maintain their self-image, they would need to be outraged at such wickedness to a man who was generous and patient, and to slaves who were just doing their duty. Let's look at the parable then. A man planted a vineyard and put a wall around it and dug a vat under the winepress and built a tower. Now, in your Bible, you might notice that that is a quote from the Old Testament. That is a quote from Isaiah. That's a quote from Isaiah 5, 1 and 2. Why does our Lord quote Isaiah 5, 1 and 2? There are two reasons. Because that would be a very familiar text to the listeners. A very familiar one. Turn to it, if you will. In Isaiah 5, the prophet Isaiah gives this same kind of analogy about the planting of a vineyard. And in the words of verse 2, he says, this vineyard, mentioned at the end of verse 1, is placed on a fertile hill. But in order to guarantee its success, he did all the things you're supposed to do, dug it all around, and removed its stones. Well, on the flatlands of Israel, this is how they worked their land. On the flatlands of Israel was the grain, and on the slopes were the vineyards. And slopes are filled with rocks. One old rabbi said in print many centuries ago that when God distributed the rocks around the world, he dumped most of them in Israel. And there's some truth in that. And so when they were getting their land ready to put the vineyards on the slopes, they would terrace them. They'd have to pull the rocks out. They would make the terrace walls by pulling out the rocks, and that's what they would do. Planted the choicest vine, good plant, built a tower in the middle of it, hewed out a wine vat. In other words, this is what you did to produce a good vineyard. You did all of this. It all made sense. You found the good land, you removed the stones, you built a protection around it, digging all around it, could be for a wall around it or even a moat around it to protect it from animals encroaching on it. And you did all these things, and you would expect at the end of verse 2 that it would produce good grapes. But this one in Isaiah 5 produced only bu'ushim. That's a Hebrew word for sour berries, not edible. This person who planted this vineyard expected good product because he did everything. There would be nothing more to do. And all he got was sour berries. Now, what's this about? Go to verse 7. Isaiah 5:7, the vineyard of the Lord. Now we know who the planter is. Who is it? It's the Lord. Is the house of Israel. The men of Judah, his delightful plant. God planted Israel, and he expected good grapes. Verse 7 says he looked for justice. He looked for righteousness. That's what that word is. He looked for righteousness. But all he saw was bloodshed. That's a play on words. He looked for mishpach. All he saw was mispah. He looked for righteousness and saw bloodshed. For righteousness, and all there was distress. Why does the Lord use that Isaiah passage here? Because he's pointing out one very important issue. The vineyard here is the vineyard of the Lord, and again, it is Israel. It is Israel. That's why he borrows that picture from Isaiah 5. So now we have one interpretive key here. The Lord is the one who plants the vineyard, and Israel is that vineyard, that plant. Notice in verse 1, everything was done that should have been done, a wall, a protection around it, a vat under the winepress where the grapes were crushed and the juice would then flow into the vat. A tower that was used for the workers to find shade and shelter, that was used as a tower to look and see if anybody was encroaching upon the vineyard to do harm, which enemies did in ancient times, and also as a place to store the tools and implements they used. Everything was done to make success out of the vineyard. Now, in Isaiah's case, what happened? Israel defected, brought forth sour berries. This is a symbol of their apostasy. They were characterized by immorality, injustice, and the rest of chapter 5, by the way, in Isaiah, lays out their sins, and they are gross sins. There's one woe after another. Woe, 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 which is a pronunciation of damnation on that vineyard, Israel, because Israel was unfaithful to God. So here you have again the history of Israel being written the same way in this parable. Well, once this was prepared, this absentee owner rented it out to vine growers and went on a journey. A long journey, we are told in one of the other Gospels. A long journey. He's gone a long, long time. He rents it out to contract tenant farmers. That was done very often. It's done today. Not everybody farming the land owns the land they farm. Tenant farmers make a contract, and they go in under that contract, and they share the proceeds of the harvest. That's exactly what was done in ancient times all over agrarian places. They would do the work, and they would keep whatever the agreed-upon percentage of the crop was. The rest would be owed to the absentee landowner, who at the appropriate time would come to receive his percentage. At the harvest time, and by the way, it usually took from the time a vineyard was first planted 5 years to come to that harvest time. So it's been a long journey for sure. At the harvest time, he sent a slave to the vine growers for the purpose of receiving some of the produce of the vineyard from the vine growers, his percentage of the crop. This is to be expected. The authorized representative comes from the man to collect the contracted amount that is due to him, and now the shocks begin to come. Verse 3, they took him and beat him. Literally, dero, they punched him. It was a serious beating. They struck him, hit him, and sent him away empty-handed. This is an unacceptable kind of conduct. To us, of course, but to the people listening, this is just outrageous conduct. This is ingratitude. They're going to be paid for their work. They're going to get to keep the greatest portion because they've done the work. This is ingratitude. This is open rebellion. This is wickedness. Well, verse 4 says, again he sent them another slave, and they wounded him in the head. Literally, they bashed his head in. And they treated him shamefully. We don't know what that was, but it's a verb that means to insult. Verse 5, he sent another. And by this time the people are saying, wait a minute here. Is that a good thing to do? You had one of them that was beaten severely. Then you had the next one that had his head bashed in. You sure you want to send another one? He sent another one, verse 5, and that one they killed. It escalates. They killed. Matthew 21:35 says Jesus actually said they stoned him to death. They picked up some of the rocks from the terraces and stoned him to death. And then it says in verse 5, and so with many others, beating some and killing others. He just kept sending them with the same results. This is bizarre behavior. This is bizarre behavior on the part of the vine growers, but this is also bizarre behavior on the part of the owner. The people must be saying, whoa, 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 enough is enough. You don't send another one, you send an army. And you exact retribution. This is enough. And then the story really gets amazing. Verse 6, he had one more to send. He's exhausted all of his slaves. He's got one more. A beloved son. And at this point, people are saying, oh, yeveh, he's not going to send the son. Some gasps in the crowd. This is the heir. This is the firstborn son. This is the most precious one in the house. But he sent him last of all to them, saying that they'll respect my son. Verse 7, those vine growers said to one another, this is the heir. Come, let's kill him, and the inheritance will be ours. Jesus loved to put these shocking aspects into his stories. Shocking, inexplicable, unexpected, unacceptable, even foolish, it seems. The crowd would be expecting that rather than send the son, he would pull together a force and go back and exact justice with government backing and bring about the death of those murderers who brutalized and killed his slaves. And a slaughter would be just. Justice, by the way, long delayed, but no. He sends his son, and with no hesitation, they kill him. And they wouldn't even give him a burial. They just threw him out of the vineyard to be consumed by the scavengers. Nobody left to send. All the possible options exhausted. Then comes the question in verse 9, what will the owner of the vineyard do? Boy, what a provocative question. What will the owner of the vineyard do? Well, if he exacted Old Testament law, it would be capital punishment to all of them, right? Genesis 9:6, capital punishment for all of them. What will the owner of the vineyard do? At that point, Matthew's account tells us that the people shouted an answer. They said to him, Matthew 21:41, bring those wretches to a wretched end. Well, he's got them hooked, hasn't he? They're giving him back the right answer. Bring those wretches to a wretched end. They even double use a severe word. Yeah, you can just hear it going through the crowd. That's what he's got to do. And then, according to Matthew 21:41, they also said, and he will rent out the vineyard to other vine growers who will pay him the proceeds at the proper season. They got the right ending, and that's what Mark says. He'll come and destroy the vine growers and give the vineyard to others. Jesus is affirming what the crowd said. The crowd gave him the answer as recorded in Matthew 21, and Jesus affirms it as recorded in Mark 12. But at that point, something interesting is happening. Because Luke 20, verse 16, in Luke's account says, when they heard it, they said, may it never be. May it never be. Why would they say that? Me genetai, the strongest negative in the Greek language. May it never happen. I think I know why they said that. Because of verse 12. They were seeking to seize him, the leaders, and yet they feared the people, for they understood that he spoke the parable against what? Them. They were starting to make sense out of this thing. No, 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 no. May it never be. So we get a hint at what's coming here. They've been sucked in. They have now taken the side of the owner against the tenant farmers, which means they've taken the side of God against themselves. Well, that's the parable. Let's look at the interpretation, okay? A man planted a vineyard. Who's the planter? God, the originator, possessor of the vineyard. What's the vineyard? Israel, from Isaiah 5. That's so important. That's a key interpreting principle, and that's why you have the language of this opening verse borrowed from the second verse of Isaiah 5. Who are the vine growers? The goys. They are the religious leaders. They are the religious leaders, those who are given care over Israel, those who were to tend God's people, the stewards of God's possession. They are wretched. According to Jesus' words this same week in Matthew 23, they are hypocrites, 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 hypocrites. They are called sons of hell. But they were the religious leaders, the Sanhedrin, the scribes, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, all of them. What is this journey? This is the period of Old Testament history. Period of Old Testament history. Through the history of Israel, God has planted His people from Abraham on, and He has placed over them priests, a priestly line. He has given them His law. He has brought people to the study of that law, scribes, for the purpose of teaching that law, for the purpose of distributing to them His own revelation and His own will, and bringing them to true worship. These leaders have the responsibility before God to give the truth to His people. Harvest time, what's that? That's the season when God comes to expect the spiritual fruit. And God expects, because of what He's given, the truth, the law, the Scriptures, the Old Testament to Israel, and He's placed over them those who study the law, like Ezra, who set that whole thing in motion, who are responsible to disseminate the truth of God to the people and bring them to a place of true worship. However, when time comes for God to look at His people and assess the situation, it is a serious situation indeed. When God comes to expect spiritual fruit, something good, He finds His people repeatedly throughout the Old Testament and even in this hour that we see here, unfaithful to Him. It's always sour berries, if we can borrow from Isaiah.